As I mentioned, we do have a hard start today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jeremy Horst. I'm the president of the SWA, and we're super excited as a board and an association to offer a real live person event. Thank you for coming. We appreciate it. I also want to thank and acknowledge that we do have some people that have logged in outside of the Ontario marketplace. The association recently has shifted some focus. We're now the Seal and Waterproofing Association of Canada, no longer Ontario. So we do have probably a dozen people logging in from British Columbia and Alberta, members, affiliates, for members on the board and other people that wanted to join in on this technical seminar. Today's seminar is entitled Economic Observations for the Construction Industry in Volatile Times. The presentation will be focusing on the overall economy as it relates to construction, construction-specific inflation such as rising input costs for steel, wood, aluminum, and cement, discussing regular supply chain issues related to construction, rising labor costs in the construction industry, low interest rates in entering the construction field, leaving good jobs unfulfilled, and then also clearly we're heading towards an impending interest rate increase. So the board has invited Mr. Peter Norman. He is a guest speaker today. He is from the Altus Group, and he is the vice president and chief economist for the Altus Group. Peter is a well-known professional land economist and forecaster, and is vice president and chief economist at the Altus Group, widely quoted in the Canadian media. Mr. Norman is a frequent expert witness on economic matters and leads a national team of economic consultants advising private and public sector organizations across Canada, providing economic intelligence and strategic information. Mr. Norman earned a BA at the Trent University and an MA at the University of Guelph. He has sat on the executive committee at the Toronto Association of Business and Economics, the Economic Research Committee of the Canadian Home Builders Association, and is a member of the Association of Ontario Land Economists and a member of Lambda Alpha International, an honorary society for the advancement of land economics. Peter lives with his wife and his 4 children in Toronto. So let's please welcome Peter.
Massive wires here.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks so much for inviting me out to your first real live person, real in-person event. It's quite an honor. I've actually had the opportunity now of joining several groups in their very first in-person event. That seems to be the thing that's happening right now. Nobody can be more pleased than me that we are getting back out into it and doing it. And hopefully this isn't a super spreader event, right? Let's touch some wood. I don't think it is. I don't think it is. But that being said, I changed the title slightly from what's on the flyer and that was read out, just to kind of simplify a little. I'm going to talk about waves and war. Because the waves of the pandemic are going to come into play in terms of the way I'm analyzing this stuff, and the war is playing a real impact. It's having a real impact right now on the Canadian economy, and I'm going to work through a little bit of that as well, because this is relatively new stuff, and I think that it's something that we need to be kind of concerned about as we move forward. So again, thank you very much for inviting me out, and let's sit back and enjoy the next several minutes as we go through my observations around the economy, the construction sector, and a bunch of other stuff as well. So a couple of the key themes going into it, I kind of hinted at that a little bit before. Where we've come and where we are right now is pretty important to understanding what's coming ahead. lots of us would like to sort of think that the pandemic is over and past us, and that now it's just a matter of catching the tail of the dragon of this great growth wave and making sure that we capitalize on it as much as possible. And I think all of that is probably true. But in terms of some of the risks, the risk environment that we're in right now, it very much has to do with the huge gyrations in the economy over the last 24 months or so, and the implications for those gyrations coming forward. So if you have to characterize the period of the economy that we're in right now in Ontario, we characterize it as volatile. It's a period of volatility. And volatility is never great when you're talking about risks around making decisions going forward. In fact, volatility often kind of throws wrenches into those works. So that's going to be one of the themes we're going to talk about a lot. The war in Ukraine has done nothing but elevate a lot of the risks in the economy of Ontario right now, and I'll get a little bit more into that right now. Obviously, the war itself is a tragedy, and there are massive amounts of tragic news and tragic circumstances that come out of it. And in addition to all of that, it's something that we should be watching very closely right now in terms of its impact on the way we do business and our business environment as well. And a lot of that is coming through inflationary pressures. I'm going to spend a fair amount of my time remarking on inflationary pressures, and then give a little bit of a heads up as to where we're going in terms of construction in general and housing in particular as well as we go forward. Hopefully this is advancing okay. And I want to start, oh my goodness gracious. Big room and small letters, right? So yeah, 24 months of putting slides up on people's screens when they're sitting 9 inches from them has been, anyway, nonetheless, I do apologize about that, and I'll try to work you through a little bit of it because it may be that it's a little bit difficult to see. But part of what I'm talking about right now in front of you is just the international economy and the international world that influences our area here and what we're doing in Ontario. And the stylized fact of the world economy is that, prior to the pandemic, it had been kind of skedaddling along at something like, 2 or 3 or 4% per year, depending on whether it was a slow year or a fast year. Developing countries generally a little bit faster than developed countries, et cetera. But nonetheless, a dependable pace of growth, dependable pace of growth of supply chains, of new products, and so on and so forth that go through it. The pandemic really interrupted that all over the place by shrinking the economy by a couple of percent for all of 2020. Most of that decline was in the immediate few quarters right after the onset, but enough so that the economy shrank for the second time, or only the second time since the Second World War. Pretty momentous event. And so when you look at supply chain issues and disruptions that we have right now, a lot of it still has its fingerprints on that 2020 environment where things slowed down so fast, so much of the economy all around the world got kind of taken offline, and then it's difficult to bring it back on. Obviously, we had much stronger growth last year, whether you're talking about the world economy, the U.S. economy, which is in the middle panel that you're looking at there, or even the Canadian economy, although Canada's economy didn't bounce back as fast as in the U.S., and also the decline was sharper during the pandemic. But nonetheless, everybody's kind of followed that path. And that as of January, and I'm just illustrating in the lighter blue color, as of January, the expectation was the world economy would be back on track for about 4.5% this year, and a similar amount of growth next year, and getting back onto a normal path. Factors behind that included vaccines and so on and so forth, in order to get us past the risk of running into periods of regional lockdowns and other factors that slow down the economy. Now, with the war in Europe, in Ukraine, we've basically taken about a percentage point out of that international growth environment. That's what we're illustrating up there, and a little bit into next year as well. It's slowed down that pace of recovery, and I think that has implications in North America. And you see the U.S. Growth slowed down quite a bit, even more so because of the issues of the price of energy, and then ultimately in Canada, not quite as big an impact, but the Canadian piece itself is a combination of a few different effects. And so when we kind of look across the country in Canada, overall, we're looking at slower growth this year and next year as a direct result of the war in Ukraine and the impact that it's having on international commodity prices. Now, in many cases, that's because big parts of the Canadian economy consume commodities. I mean, whether you're talking about the price of energy, but also a whole wide array of things like copper and nickel and elsewhere going into Canadian products and into Canadian economy, being affected, the prices being affected by that war, and that's slowing down the pace of growth here. Only in energy dependent provinces like Alberta will probably see a little bit of a boost in growth as a result of the higher, well, we definitely will see a boost in growth as a result of those higher energy prices. So overall, the Canadian picture isn't as quite as affected as it is in the US, but nonetheless it is affected. And so part of the question here, I mean, we are talking about the effects of the war, and how that's just differentiating the last couple of months in terms of some of the economic outlook. But in particular, we also, continue to worry about the risks of the overall effects of the pandemic and what it had on our economy, as big parts of the economy went offline initially, started to come back. We had growth. And we talk about GDP growth a lot of times in terms of percentage change, and we know it was very fast percentage change last year. I showed that earlier. But I also illustrate here this kind of context of GDP as also like a stock. Like it's also GDP is essentially just the income of everybody in Ontario. I mean, essentially all the income of all people and businesses in Ontario is more or less what GDP is. So when we talk about growth being, minus 5% or plus 7% or whatever, that's a concept of growth. But at the same time, there's just a concept of how much income, how much economic activity, how much earnings are going on by people and businesses in the economy. And by that front, we took so much of the economy offline during the pandemic. A lot of it came back fairly rapidly. But at this point in time, the Ontario economy, continues to be, something like about 50 to $70 billion smaller than it would be if we had not gone through that at all. And so a lot of that are those, those waves of the pandemic that have made us take components of the economy offline. And the lingering effects of those waves is that in the end, we're starting from a much lower base. We've got this economy which continues to be, significantly smaller than it would be before, and that as well kind of introduces risks as we go forward. I don't usually spend much time talking about the unemployment rate because I don't think unemployment rate is a massively helpful indicator. But this chart illustrates a couple of important concepts right now in terms of context. And the first of those being that, the unemployment rate in Ontario, which, under normal circumstances is somewhere around 5 or 6%, shot up really fast during the recession we had in 2009, as you can see. And then it took a whole decade to come back down to normal. The 2009 recession, which I think a lot of us may have thought just passed us by pretty quickly, affected labor markets in a pretty significant way. And it took about a decade to see that rate come back to normal. And then it shot up very high during the early months of the pandemic, but started to recover much more quickly during the recovery from the pandemic. And really over the last 24 months now, it's made that same recovery back to a relatively normal rate of around 5.5%. The labor market is kind of back on track, more or less. at about 5.5% unemployment, and we have recovered all the jobs that were lost during the pandemic in Ontario and in Canada as a whole. But in part, the swings, the big swings that you see in that unemployment rate over the last 24 months continue to be a kind of a risk going forward. It shows how sensitive our pace of economic growth is to additional waves of the pandemic. So the waves that we've had, the major waves that we've had so far, then Omicron told us right at a time when we thought that we were kind of out of the woods, Omicron told us that, oh, wait a second, we can take the economy offline again and have more disruptions. And now it's kind of getting back to normal again. But the next wave, it's hard to say how that's going to play out. But what we do know is that the economy ends up being sensitive to those waves. And that's what we continue to kind of keep our eye on as well when we think about the longevity of this piece. The labor market itself is under stress right now in Ontario, and the stress is coming from all sorts of different places and exhibiting itself in different ways. So the first thing I want to point out is that even though we've recovered all of the jobs, in fact, we're sitting at about 2%. I think these are actually the Canadian data right here, but more or less the same pattern. Even though we've recovered all of the jobs lost in the pandemic, in fact, we're sitting at about 2% higher than we were pre-pandemic. We haven't recovered jobs for young people. In fact, young people, the unemployment rate remains quite elevated. I mean, people that are under the age of 25 in the labor force, quite elevated. And there are fewer people under the age of 25 employed today than there were prior to the pandemic. And also that kind of pre-retirement group as well. We see higher unemployment and lower performance. And all of this coming at a time when you talk to almost any business, of which probably all of you guys qualify, it's difficult to hire people. It's very difficult to hire people. This comes at a time when we have pretty significant shortages in the labor force of people who have the skills for the tasks that are being required to expand businesses in a fairly strong way during the expansion of the pandemic. We've had people who have been kind of changing careers and stuff like that and falling kind of in the cracks, I suppose, and to some extent in terms of the right kinds of skills for the right kinds of jobs. But nonetheless, we have this real kind of conundrum where there still continues to be a lot of people who are seeking work and not finding it, and a lot of businesses who are looking for workers and can't find them either. And that kind of conundrum will continue to, take a number of months and quarters and maybe years ahead to play out as we, get out of this volatile period of, minus something percent and then positive something percent and then minus something percent and positive, and then get back onto a little bit more of a steady growth path as we go forward. That didn't advance. Just a little illustration of what I mean by the economy going offline and the various components. Here we have like two pieces that I think people point to pretty significantly when they're talking about components of the economy going offline during the early days of the pandemic, one being retail, the other being hospitality. Retail, very, very strong recovery once people got back on stream and starting to spend. It's not all going through bricks and mortar channel, not as much of it as it was before, but nonetheless, households continue to spend very, 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 very actively. We've got retail sales up about 10% from pre-pandemic times and continuing to grow pretty steadily. We also have a fair amount of that spend going back into bricks and mortar now, much more so than perhaps some of our early fears were as well. So the retail sector is stabilizing very well. Hospitality continues to be very, very stressed, very distressed. It's still down about 15% from pre-pandemic levels, and its recovery continues to be a lot slower, despite the fact, even during the periods of time when we have not been in kind of lockdowns, that recovery, the spend recovery has been a lot slower. So that's a kind of an illustration of how the economy is coping with these waves, and an illustration of some of the risks that we might have going forward as well. Let's switch gears a little bit and start talking about prices. And I'm going to talk about a number of different kinds of prices as we go forward. The first just being general inflation, because I think that when you ask people now, inflation is an issue. It's an issue with consumers who are going to the grocery store. It's an issue with businesses who are purchasing inputs in order to put their product together. It's an issue for governments who are concerned about financial stability and other issues. We haven't had significant inflation in this country for over 30 years. And so to some extent, our policy environment is getting a little bit rusty on how to deal with that. Businesses are getting a little bit rusty on how to deal with it, and it's creating other issues as well. One of the first things that I want to mention is that up until a couple of months ago, at least, the inflation analysis in Ontario or in Canada was very much one where you try to determine whether rising prices are the result of what we call kind of transitory factors. And these are factors that are kind of one-time effects that are pushing some prices up for one reason or another. And that once those factors go away, prices will return to a more normal level. Or structural factors. And structural factors are things that kind of push prices up, but those factors remain in place for higher prices the next year and the next year and the next year. And generally speaking, for most of Canadian inflation, I would say transitory, not structural factors were at play. Those transitory factors in particular really had to do with interruptions to the supply chain, directly related to the pandemic, international supply chain and domestic supply chain directly related to the pandemic, shortages in particular that led to prices being bid up of one sort or another. That's definitely a transitory factor because supply chains always readjust. Maybe it takes a little bit of time, but somebody figures out how to get a good from China to Canada in a more efficient way than the last guy, and that adjusts. It might take a number of months or a number of quarters, but it adjusts. And then the other transitory factor, of course, is not even, it's a transitory, but it's also just a mathematical factor, is that we went through a number of months during the depth of the pandemic when most prices were going down. Prices for most of the things we buy were going down during the pandemic. And then in 2021, we started to see a lot of recovery where prices not only were going up by a normal basis, but we're also making up for the prices that had gone down earlier. So that's why in this little illustration that I made for you, I've illustrated that if you take consumer prices and measure them on a 2-year basis, like how prices changed on an annual average basis over the last 2 years, we continue to pretty much just be in the normal range. Actually, we're not even outside of that 1 to 3%, which is from a policy perspective considered normal. So, inflation can, up until at least the last couple of months, inflation has been concerning from a headline perspective, but wasn't really affecting people's bottom lines all that much going into, at least on the consumer side, going into, say, January, February of this year. And then the last couple of months of inflation have been a little bit different. And in particular, we're starting to see it shoot up against that, out of that normal range, even on a 2-year basis. And we're continuing to see acceleration on the headline rate. And a lot of that is because of this continued effects on supply chains and on the price of commodities coming out of the war in Europe. And the longevity of that, or in particular the longevity of those price effects, is uncertain. It continues to be uncertain, and it continues to be a bigger and bigger risk, I think, for us. Whether we're trying to talk about the confidence and ability for consumers to buy stuff and to have confidence in the market, or whether we're talking about businesses who are trying to operate under uncertain times as well. I think that the exacerbation of this issue from the war is more likely to lead to kind of structural changes. Structural changes be where you start to see those commodity prices rise. You start to see that flow through into the price of goods. Then you start to see the consumers of those goods demanding higher wages from their employers, and then those higher wages feeding through into yet higher prices for those goods. So far, that's been a little bit absent, but that there's more of a risk now as this goes on, that's going to be, what we're going to be coping with over the next few years. Materials of raw material prices really going haywire. and in particular in the last couple of months. And in fact, because I'm illustrating materials prices from a database which is monthly, I'm not even showing some of the really strong increases in the spot price in the last number of weeks as well, coming out of the war. So hard to see, of course, but that that oil price showing oil prices almost double where they were pre-pandemic. Potash and other minerals up there in the sort of 50% higher than they were pre-pandemic line. And then we have, and nickel as well, nickel and a number of other rare commodities, very, very strong price and accelerating right now in the last number of weeks, playing into, not just the general economy, but metals like that play into electronics and also the auto sector, leading through to increase in prices of things that are staple goods for households in Canada. And yet at the same time, we have some commodities which has been pretty flat, right? Mostly ones that haven't been affected by international supply chains so much. So stone and gravel and others, we're seeing not showing that as much of that upward pressure right now. And when we look at building materials as well, large amounts of fluctuation, not just from recent effects, although that acceleration recently is happening, whether you're looking at iron products like rebar or structural steel type products, where we're seeing that start to accelerate quite a bit right now because through shortages, supply chain shortage, and just a lot of construction activity, which I'll get to in a minute, which is drawing on these materials. But also we've got these wide fluctuations in wood, which throughout the pandemic has been hard to tame going through. We had sawmills going offline early on in the pandemic, and we saw companies misjudging how fast housing would come back and how fast demand for wood would come back, mostly south of the border, but also here. And then sawmills were offline, and they took a long time to come back online. That was that first wave of wood shortages and price increases that we saw coming to market last spring, early summer. You see that big spike that we've got there. And then more recently as well, we've got wood going back up again because of just the sheer increases in housing starts, and particularly housing starts south of the border that continue to draw a lot of that wood out of the Canadian marketplace. So building material prices continue to be a real kind of challenge for builders and the construction industry in Ontario. And then the last thing I just have just food inputs, because this is something affecting consumers right off the bat. And in particular, those wheat prices and canola prices shooting up fairly strongly throughout the latter half of last year. Again, some supply chain interruptions, but in addition to that, there have been some disruptions on growing in Western Canada and elsewhere. And now, again, I don't have the spot price in here, but we've seen wheat prices double again just since the beginning of the war, and probably will have effects at least a year long or more until we start to get Ukraine back on stream in terms of production. And so those disruptions continue to be disruptive, and they will be disruptive at the grocery store, I think, for the months ahead, certainly anyway. And all of this plays into that kind of original framework I gave you. Is this transitory or is it structural? And the longer these things have an effect on consumers and their need to bid up wages, the more likely it is to be a little bit more structural as we go forward. I want to talk a little bit about labor now. In particular, I'm going to focus in on the construction industry. And again, apologies for the smallness of all of this, but hopefully I can kind of talk you through it to a little bit as well. The four panels are telling a four-panel story about the construction industry right now, which is not necessarily a very optimistic story for going forward. The first being that the unemployment rate in the construction industry, over on the very left-hand side there, of course, it went up during the pandemic, but it has shot down. It's only sitting at about 4.8%. It's a pretty low rate right now for construction. There's a lot of labor shortages right now in construction in Ontario. And that's even just looking at the 21 number. The most recent number is lower than that. And then the next panel over, the second from the left, is what we call job shortages. So vacancies in the construction sector, where the construction sector is looking for a worker but can't find one, going back to 2018, 2019, which itself was not a time of massive, it was still hard to hire people in the construction industry, but it was a more normal time. Job vacancies then across the province were about 10,000. There were 10,000 construction workers where there was a spot on crews, but they couldn't hire somebody for it. And that number has shot up to 20,000. And in particular, that black bar is the trades, basically. So we've got a real shortage of the trades, and also just for buildings construction, so general construction crews. Heavy engineering, not so much so. The job vacancies remains pretty low in heavy engineering. But in particular, it's the trades, and it's like ICI and residential building construction. 20,000 empty spots on crews right now, and it continues to go up, basically. So that's an issue at a time when you have very low unemployment. It's an issue when you talk to almost anybody in the construction industry, it's difficult to motivate a lot of new recruits to come into the industry. There's not enough people graduating from community college programs right now in order to fill all of those spots, certainly, on a regular basis. Nonetheless, the big shortfall right now, and this all coming at a time when the construction industry in general is taking on more and more work. So those job vacancies right now in construction sitting at about 5%, or about 20,000 workers. And then on the final panel on the right, and I apologize about being small, but what I'm illustrating here is construction wages and some of the risk environment right now in that marketplace. Union wage increases in Ontario, 19, 20, and 21, we're sitting at an average of about 2.2%, where they, depending on which group you're looking at, but nonetheless, the average is about 2.2% on an annual average basis in that last 3-year settlement period, which compared pretty nicely to inflation during that period. But inflation of about 1.7%, we had union wage increase of about 2.2%. It's about half a percentage point gap, which is usually around where the negotiation pressure is. So that period turned out okay. I mean, it didn't turn out okay from we had a global pandemic and a bunch of other things, but it turned out okay for workers during that period because there was a real match between inflation and wage increases. As I think everybody in the room probably knows, we're in the midst right now of negotiating sector by sector by sector across the Ontario construction sector in Ontario before the deadline at the end of this month for almost all of the agreements. And a lot of those negotiations are coming at a time when the most recent Ontario inflation print has been 6.1%. And again, I had that earlier chart that said that 6% is not really real. If you adjust it for the 2-year thing, it's more like about 3%. But nonetheless, it's still elevated, and it's elevated at a time when negotiations are taking place. So if we're talking about the risk of more systemic inflation, where it's getting into wages and prices, Ontario's construction union negotiations right now may be one of those avenues where you'll start to see those systemic issues come to play. And Ontario's construction sector is just one of our unionized sectors in Ontario. So you're seeing the same play out at different times for different components as well. And it's also affecting wages, although to a lesser extent amongst non-union sectors as well. But nonetheless, inflation at the pumps and inflation at the grocery store right now is definitely making an impact, or definitely has the potential to make an impact on these negotiations as we go forward. So anyway, a bit of risk and and look ahead on that front. This is just an illustration of, I'm not going to talk to extent, but to what extent is this affecting construction costs? There's good and bad news in here. Toronto is on the left-hand side, Ottawa is on the right. If you're concerned, if Toronto is your focus, as we went into late 2020, early 2021, that's where we saw the biggest impacts on construction costs. We saw construction costs rising at a rate of about 40% by the time we got into the second quarter of 2021, mostly for single family housing. It was around 35% for apartment, for high-rise construction. ICI construction has never seen the same kind of froth, but even it was up to about 20% on an annual rate by the second quarter of last year. And all of those rates have moderated to some extent going into the end of the year, but still sitting at something like 10 to 15% on an annual rate is still pretty strong for construction costs and concerning as well. So the good and bad news. One is that we are seeing some of the heat coming out of construction costs since last spring, but that they continue to be elevated. We're not seeing them kind of reversing or going down, but just not going up quite as fast as we go forward. Changes in wage negotiations will start to impact this in a pretty significant way, depending on how they all play out. And then the other factor about why we look at inflation, of course, is because it has a real impact on interest rates. From a policy perspective, the Bank of Canada, which is illustrated over on the right-hand side, has their bank rate. People are familiar with it and follow it in the news. And as they and this is one of the tools that they use to try to control inflation. So at the onset of the pandemic, of course, the bank rate famously came down very, very fast. I mean, almost instantly down to almost nothing, both here and in the US and in Western countries around the world, and has remained down at that very low level. And now the bank has been signaling that inflation is of concern, and are signaling that they will be trying to retrace that rate up to around where it was pre-pandemic, if not a little bit more over the months ahead. In fact, with the onset of the war in Ukraine, probably accelerating that rate at which they're bringing those interest rates up. But at this point in time, we're still looking at something like about 2 percentage points, 2% on the bank rate by sometime next year. And that's a concern because that's obviously flows through into cost of borrowing for all sorts of us, and also suggests more inflationary pressure as well. But in addition to that, it's a concern because it flows through into mortgage rates, and then mortgage rates, play to consumer confidence and housing demand, and then that also plays into the forecast for housing. But part of the good news is that most of the rate increase, that rate increase of about a 1.5% that the Bank of Canada is expecting to do in the next year or so, most of that is already priced into the mortgage market. Mortgage rates are already back up to about 3.5% in recent weeks. They may go up to around 4.5% probably by the time we get into the summertime. But most of the increase has already taken place in interest rates, and arguably you're already starting to see that in terms of a mild slowdown in housing activity. We're starting to see prices leveling off in Toronto and elsewhere, although at very high levels, of course. And I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about ICI construction for a couple of minutes. And before I do that, I want to share some thoughts about some thoughts about the office market, I suppose. So ICI construction, industrial, commercial, institutional construction. Big part of that is commercial. Commercial is pretty important. Commercial is basically offices and retail, entertainment type facilities. And so investment in offices comes from, in commercial activity, investment comes from building new office buildings and also retrofitting existing ones. So those are the two biggest sources of construction activity. There They're relatively evenly split in any given year in Ontario. We spend about as much on capex as we spend on building new construction, new buildings. But we only build new buildings if we need them, or at least that's the way it should be. And so, and the issue from the pandemic really is, how much do we need office buildings going forward? I think that's an issue that's on everybody's kind of mind, and it plays to our need to, spend construction spending on new buildings, and it also plays to some extent on capex, because it may be that that a decline in the need for office buildings, might not just curtail a lot of construction on new buildings, but it may also start to take buildings out of the stock, so they'll become conversions to residential or other issues. In Ontario, in Toronto, for example, just to focus on Toronto, in the last 2 years, we've lost about 4 to 5 million about 6 million square feet of space, about 4 million per year, in the last 2 years. Not space, but just like occupied space, like where tenants have moved out. So what we call negative absorption. Absorption is positive if people move into a building, negative if a company moves out of a building. And 6 million square feet is quite a lot. Under normal circumstances, we grow our office sector in Toronto by somewhere around 2 to 3 million square feet per year. As you can see, we've had some strong years during our short-lived tech boom in Toronto of 2016, 17, 18. We saw pretty strong office absorptions during that period. They seem to have gone by the wayside, as has a lot of the tech fervor. And companies who are coping with migrating their labor force to hybrid labor force, where people spend 1 or more days a week at home on an ongoing basis, will require less space, will reduce the amount of space that they lease, and across the market, that will reduce what we need in terms of office space. Has this had a big impact on vacancy rates yet? Not a whole lot. I show the vacancy rates on the right-hand side there. Amongst the best office buildings, we're still only sitting at about 11% vacant, which by Toronto standards is pretty high, but is not unmanageable. Older buildings, C-class buildings, it's above 20% now, will probably go higher, but that might be assisted by taking some of those buildings out of the stock and start converting them into other things. But nonetheless, there is a challenge to the construction sector, both from the perspective of the need for new buildings and ultimately in terms of the size of the stock that's out there for ongoing capex activity on those things, including waterproofing. And so when I look at the volume of construction activity in ICI, commercial is those red bars that are there. That's by far the most important component of the ICI sector. Institutional are those blue bars. It's a less important but a growing sector right now, and we've got some institutional buildings there as well, which are pretty stable. But in general, with ICI, we're looking at least for the next 5 years or so, pretty significant declines in terms of the level of construction activity into commercial, and I think that's going to be seen. We're going to see that. We're going to see that, in terms of, how many projects come up for bid. We're going to see that in terms of some relief on some of those labor force shortages we've had before. So there'll be a little bit more opportunity for labor to swing into residential. We're going to see that in terms of existing buildings and the number of existing buildings there are, or at least the growth in that, and the number of contracts for capex type projects going forward as well. So there is some concern going forward about the ICI sector. And let's see what's kind of next. Maybe I'll skip this guy. Yeah, we'll look at this one here. And so I just want to round it. I'm going to say a few things about demographics very shortly, and then a couple comments about housing, and then wrap it up. Ontario, the demographics are pretty important for all sorts of things. We need to grow our population because that creates housing demand. It also creates workforce growth that leads to a growth in our workforce spaces and so on and so forth. Generally, the economy runs on population growth. And population grows primarily in Ontario by international immigration, so that's good, and that's strong now. It's swung right back since the pandemic. In fact, there are much higher international targets now for immigrants federally, and a lot of those will come to Ontario, so that's good news. But another way that Ontario grows is sometimes people move into Ontario from other provinces, and sometimes they move out. And that's what this chart is. And you can see it does vary a lot over time, depending on whether Ontario has a stronger economy or a weaker economy, generally than places like Alberta and BC. And most recently, during our short-lived tech boom in Ontario, you could see we had very strong in-migration from other provinces. There was also a weak energy sector out west at the time. And that has now turned around pretty significantly. In fact, in the last year, Ontario lost more people to other provinces than any other year, at least over the course of this chart, which goes back about 25 years. About 45 years. So we're, like it's a real fast turnaround right now that Ontario is a lot less attractive. But high housing prices, our job growth is not as strong as elsewhere. We're not in the energy sector. Our tech boom is more or less over, and that shows up at the leading edge of population growth here, which is our domestic movements. And so this one concerns me a little bit in terms of implication going forward. This chart here is just looking at Toronto, and it kind of illustrates kind of the same thing of what I've just said. Way over to the left is international migration, and I've got the light blue is a 10-year average, and then the dark blue is last year. And by international, like immigrants, we're actually stronger than the 10-year average. It's still going well for Toronto right now. We're bringing in more immigrants than before, which is good. But the next one over is non-permanent residents. That's your foreign students and temporary workers and so on and so forth. That's turned pretty negative for Toronto in comparison to, normally it could be depended on to bring in about 20,000 net new people each and every year. And then all of these domestic fronts now, it's looking pretty negative. That I just talked about that small component, which is people going to other provinces, but people moving out of Toronto into peripheral areas of Ontario, the Guelphs and the Peterboroughs of the world, Bancroft and others, has accelerated very significantly during the pandemic, and is likely to be a bit of a trend going forward as well. Millennials are leaving the Toronto area in order to find housing elsewhere. The housing isn't particularly affordable elsewhere, but it's more affordable than Toronto, and perhaps more importantly, it's more accessible. That there's just not that much single-family housing now in the Greater Toronto area, and so you're seeing the leading edge of that coming through. And so, we do have some concerns about our ability to continue to build population growth, but it also helps to explain some of those trends that we're seeing, like, fairly rapid price increases in some of those peripheral markets at the same time as Toronto starts to see a bit of a slowdown. And then, the slowdown in Toronto hasn't really shown up yet in terms of housing. It's probably good news in general. In fact, home sales for new home sales last year, a record year that we've seen in quite a few years. So over 46,000 home sales in the Greater Toronto area alone, higher than 2016, which was our previous high watermark. And mostly that growth was coming from the apartment sector. Right? We don't have really strong demand for apartments right now because the aging population is looking for single family, but that's all that people can live in. So, and we've got a lot of interest in building them by builders because many of these projects are trying to get into the ground before some more stringent policy around the corner and stuff like that. So we had a lot of sales. 32,000 apartments, like condo sales last year in Greater Toronto area alone. Single family sales declining a little bit, but that's mainly because there's almost nothing to buy. There are very few projects left. There's, I think, less than about 1,000 units of inventory at any given time. I think most recent month was about 600 single family lots for sale in all of the GTA, which is not enough for demand, but they're also quite expensive. So we're starting to see that waning, but sales remain pretty strong in the GTA to come forward. So that will continue to have. Let me just make sure that goes forward. That will continue to have a a stimulating effect for residential construction. And that's what's really seen that really strong surge in construction that we've seen more recently. This chart here over on the left-hand side is looking at Toronto and Hamilton together. And then the rest is the rest of the province. And part of that is showing that despite the strongest sales in Toronto last year, we're not up all that much. Last year's housing starts were just about 8% higher than they were about 2006. So we've got all this kind of demand and we've got all those sales taking place or whatever. But in terms of starts, they're not all that strong. There has been a real shift into apartments from single family. But when we look elsewhere in Ontario, outside of Toronto and Hamilton, we're running about 60% higher residential now than we were before. And even, not just from going back to the 2006 base mark, but even just the most recent few years, we're seeing significantly more single family and apartment construction, and a lot of that's running in those peripheral markets where we see population moving out to in order to fuel a lot of that demand. So I think that's probably a trend that we'll start to see more of going forward, and that we'll continue to watch for. But a lot of the construction is moving, particularly residential construction, moving out of the GTA as we see a lot of those markets showing a lot more potential. This is just our forecast. I'm not going to go through it, but we had 100,000 housing starts in Ontario last year. This year, probably just a little bit under that for the next couple of years going forward. So we'll remain elevated, but it's not going to exceed 100,000. Some of those factors include the shortages of labor and materials and stuff that we spent so much time talking about. Some of it really has to do with kind of moving down from that wave of movement outside of Toronto as well. So we will see constraints keeping housing starts at around that 100,000 level for that, but that's strong by historical standards. And I think that pretty much brings us to the end of my. I will make one more remark. Sorry. The left-hand side is just the forecast. And I was talking at the table here a little bit as well. This is a nice thing to round off on. So there's a recognized housing shortage, I guess, in Ontario, notwithstanding the fact that we've started to see construction picking up, and we've started to see sales sort of picking up. Recognized housing shortages has led to these really high prices. We can go on for hours about that, but that's it. And then there was a task force convened by the provincial government in December that came out with a report in February that came out with 54 recommendations on ways that the province can deal with this housing supply shortage and try to bring more housing on stream. And then there was a bill last week by the provincial government in order to put in place some of those measures, although they only chose about 3 of the measures to put in place out of the 54 recommendations. So I guess there's more work to be done after that. But anyway, nonetheless, part of the framing objectives of both the report and also the bill was that the Premier said that there would need to be an additional 1.5 million homes built in Ontario over the next 10 years, if you can put in place the policies to do so. And so I just thought I would illustrate what that would mean. So all of those construction constraints and stuff like that we have right now, in order to get ourselves up to that level, would have to somehow just disappear so that we can just start building massive amounts of new housing. I think it's probably the constraints will win the day more than some of those policies to try to improve things around the edges. So I don't think that we're going to get up to 180 housing starts per year over the next decade, but nonetheless, that's been the stated objective by the provincial government. And that's me. I've got some contact information there, and I don't know whether we've got time for questions or if that's built in, but if you want to do that, we can do that. Otherwise, I can sit down.
Yeah, I think we do have time for some questions. I'm sure there's questions from the floor. Fire away, I guess, and hopefully you can speak louder, or I can try and bring the mic if necessary. But if anyone has any questions, yeah. Bill, I knew he was going to have a question.
So, Peter, part of our industry here is in the restoration, waterproofing, existing buildings become our marketplace. So all the new builds, they become part of our market. The challenge we have in our industry right now is we're getting huge price increases coming from manufacturers, aggregate, disposal companies, fuel, everything that has rising fuel costs, whether it's to operate the vehicle or to create the polymer resin or the hot waterproofing that we use. The challenge is these numbers are up in the 10, 20, in fact, upwards of 30%. And they're coming now, and I think we've all seen the letters that it's coming out to the manufacturers, is due to rising costs, we have no choice, we have to pass this on to you guys. So our challenge in this industry is how do we let our end customers know that, which is in effect the owners of the office building, the industrial warehouse, the apartment building, or the condominium. How do we let them know that? Because the engineering community can say, here's what's happening, Mr. Owner, and the owner is like, I don't care. I'm not going to entertain it. You're not going to get an inflationary increase. You signed a contract for 2 years. How do we as an industry say that, Mr. Owner, these are recognizable input costs that have to be passed through? Is there a way in the economic sense to pass that information on? Like, could we say in our tenders that this price is good for 30 days, or we reserve the right to renegotiate key cost components like a lot of waterproofing materials or stuff like that? Is there any thoughts you would have on that?
I guess I would suggest you try to do any or all of that. I mean, part of my message about inflation, I mean, I used the expression earlier about the normal range, 1% to 3%. 1% to 3% is that sweet spot. It doesn't really matter about whether you're talking about consumer goods and the consumer or whether you're talking about inputs into the production process of waterproofing trades or the construction sector or the automobile sector or anything else. 1% to 3%, everybody gets their head around, right? You can kind of plan for that. You can kind of, figure out what that means. You can adjust pricing well in advance. You can, make long bids and with some amount of confidence because you're building in, an appropriate amount of contingency or whatever it may be. That's the way we do business. And we've been in that 1% to 3% range since, the early 1990s, basically, when it kind of got into that range. And so all of us have built our businesses basically around that range, and we're kind of happy. We're kind of happy with figuring that out. So why does inflation slow down the economy? I said right at the beginning that the inflation that's coming, the inflationary pressures that are just coming in the last several weeks is already has a 1 percentage point impact on our potential economic growth in this country this year. So why is it that inflation itself slows down the economy? Isn't it just people paying more for something and then you just go on your happy way? And if you're lucky, you can maybe get some more money from your boss and everything flows through okay. It slows things down because work doesn't get done. So, I don't know exactly how to answer your question about operationally about how you go to that building owner and try to make them recognize your additional costs. But either you're going to do the work or you're not going to do the work, or you're going to reprice it in some way, whether it's a mechanism that you build into the contract or where you force a change. And if you don't do that work, then the work doesn't get done and the economy slows down. And that building doesn't get, the work doesn't get done in that building. It doesn't get completed or it doesn't get converted or whatever. And then that slows down. I mean, that's why inflation is pernicious to the economy. Individuals always figure out a way. I mean, individual companies, individuals figure out a way to do stuff. It might be that, that they price things differently. It might be whatever. But passing on higher fees is not always that easy in any kind of business. And, And so, so really the economy slows down as a result. So I don't know operationally how to do that. I think probably, I mean, you see clever things all over the place, clever models all over the place. You see everyone who flies knows that every time the oil price goes up, you get an extra couple of charges on your plane ticket bill that you don't even see when you're first browsing the web for that price. Sometimes they go away, sometimes they don't when prices come down. But anyway, nonetheless, you see that kind of thing happening all the time and things like that. So I suspect that everybody, not just the sealant and waterproofing guys, I suspect everybody in the construction industry is coping with these kinds of things right now. I hear now like that people like trades are not guaranteeing their prices for more than very short periods of time now, or maybe not even at all and stuff like that. And that's different. I'm starting to hear now that condo developers are changing their metric in terms of what they sell and how they sell it. So in Ontario in particular, this isn't a universal practice, but in Ontario after the crash of the 1980s, condo developers almost always sell out about 70% of their building. In fact, if you're getting bank financing, you more or less for your construction, you more or less require that. But even the guys who had deep pockets and don't need the banks, we're still doing that practice. Now you're seeing more developers going forward with spec development so that they can like absorb costs and then try and charge as much as they can for the condo at the end, rather than locking in their revenue with a pre-sale. So that's changing. That's changing the way they're doing business. Everybody's going to change the way they do business.
Any other questions?
Apologies about the small print. I'm gonna I'll do the view a note in my mind that in this room don't have small print. Sometimes the screens are quite large.
Okay.
And good and congratulations to those in the front three tables who can probably read anything that I put up there, more or less. And I'm assuming that you guys will just get a copy of this as well. So that's you can. Okay, well, thanks very much, everybody.